Well, you just picked the wrong guy for what you want.
Did I?
Yeah, I'm not in the market.
I wasn't shopping.
Paul Newman was a movie star so impossibly attractive that all the most famous faces of Hollywood, both male and female, wanted to bed him. He complied enthusiastically. In spite of being a married man with 3 children, Newman had affairs with different people, and they weren't all females. Surprised? Well, sit back as the full details are out. But how did he manage to hide it all these years? And how did he remain in the limelight? Join us as we unveil the names the men Paul Newman was secretly in love with. Marlon Brando, the major chaos. There was more homosexual activity than hetero in Newman's early years, although at times he hated himself for his gay proclivities. The rest of his life was lived trying to suppress these homosexual urges, knowing what a detriment it could be to a high-profile acting career. However, he continued to participate in homosexual activity. Gay porn star Cal Culver claimed that he was the last man to have sex with Newman. At 83, one of the names Paul Newman mentioned first was Marlon Brando. And who doesn't know the Godfather legend? They first met in 1961 at a fundraising gala at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. Paul, as always elegant and well-groomed, arrived with his wife Joanne Woodward. Brando, on the other hand, arrived late with an appearance that strictly contrasted Paul's.
You don't have to mean it or anything. Just ask us to stick around, I promise you.
That first night, they didn't talk much, not that they had no words, but hey, courtesy, right? Actually, it wasn't really courtesy, it's just that there was some kind of electric between them, and words weren't needed. The dangerous part was that both of them couldn't resist. Having read that Brando rode his motorcycle around the city every night after his performance, Newman searched the alleys behind the theater until he spotted a motorcycle. An hour after the curtain, Brando appeared, and Paul nervously confronted his prey with a well-rehearsed line. "Mr. Brando, you're the greatest thing since God granted men the right to come." It worked like a charm. Paul found himself on the back of Brando's motorcycle, racing through the dark hills above Mulholland Drive, the wind cutting through his hair as he nonchalantly wrapped his arms tight around the man the press called uncontrollable. He recalled thinking that if they crashed, at least he'd die feeling free. And for 2 months, they lived like that, on borrowed time in hidden places.
Nothing? Nothing? Howdy, Sundance.
Well, you sure are. You're doing something. What?
There were no plans, no promises, just the weird chemistry between them. Brando was like a storm. He could be tender one moment, wild the next. He would cook dinner shirtless, dance barefoot to old jazz records, then vanish for 3 days without a word. And when he came back, he'd act like nothing had happened. One afternoon, Paul received a phone call from a studio executive. There were whispers, photographs, a tabloid reporter asking the wrong questions. That night, Brando arrived at Paul's apartment with his eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't sit. He didn't touch him. He simply said, "They know." Paul offered to leave town, to run, to disappear together. But Brando laughed. And just like that, it was over. They never fought. They never said goodbye. Marlon simply walked out the door and never came back. Not as a lover, not as a friend, just another Hollywood ghost. Years later, Paul would still catch his name in headlines. Another scandal, another marriage, another strange quote in a magazine. But to him, Marlon was always that barefoot man by the pool, biting grapes from a whiskey glass, looking at him like he was the only truth in a city of make-believe. He kept a postcard Brando once sent him. No signature, no words, just a picture of a burning house. On the back, in small handwriting, were 4 words: "We could have had this."
Really rooting for you, Butch.
Thank you, Flatner.
Paul Newman never forgot him. While Brando left Newman with nothing but a ghost of what could have been, another man stepped in with a hotter fire. Robert Redford, bromance to romance. The bromance between Paul Newman and Redford caught Hollywood in a cowboy craze named Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The press called it the most perfect combination of 2 men audiences had ever seen on screen. Paul Newman was Butch. He was charismatic, intelligent, and cunning. Robert Redford was Sundance, cool, sharp, but don't be fooled, he was also dangerous. Only a few people knew that when those scenes were filmed at Zion National Park, Utah in late May, something else was quietly developing behind the scenes every time the cameras stopped rolling. It was a love story, one that wasn't in the scripts. At the time, Paul Newman was 44 and was living with his wife Joanne Woodward in Connecticut. Robert Redford was a whole decade younger than him. He was only 32 and already married to Lola Van Wagenen and had 3 young children. Both were family men and both were symbols in their days. But between them, a strange attraction was there. Something that made us secretly wait for the next scene just to stand beside each other or simply look at each other for a few seconds longer than usual. One weekend night when the entire crew was staying at a motel,
That makes it our responsibility to get out there and get after them. Now you're going to have to bring your own horses.
in Springdale, Utah, according to a lighting technician named Dennis Corbin, he once saw Paul standing on Redford's balcony at midnight, holding a cigarette, eyes red-rimmed. According to him, he didn't dare ask, but he saw Robert open the door, pull him in, and they disappeared. And guess what? That wasn't the last time. From the 1970s until the early 80s, these 2 men lived 2 parallel lives. They were legendary co-stars by day, and by night, well, that was completely different. They were overs in the shadows, but only one of them believed that the relationship was real, while the other just wanted to hide it. Paul once planned to reveal the truth to a trusted journalist from The New Yorker who had written a long interview with Paul the previous year. At their meeting at the Algonquin Hotel in Manhattan, just hours before the interview was scheduled, Paul received a phone call from Robert Redford's representative where he was threatened that if he said a word about it, he'd lose everything. And that very night, the said journalist received an anonymous fax accusing Paul Newman of having mental problems, drinking prescription medication, and once shoving a female assistant while drunk. Well, needless to say, the interview was canceled. On a rare occasion at the BAFTA Awards in 1980, when a reporter asked Robert if he still kept in touch with Paul, he simply replied in a nonchalant tone that they made something great together, but everyone had to move on.
How long before you figure they're not after us?
Then he turned away, not waiting for the next question, and that was how their love ended. One might think Redford was the peak of his pain, but no, because the next name Paul mentioned was someone who, at just 24, brought America to tears. James Dean, the companion. James Dean was not the most scandalous love, but it was the one that caused him the most pain. A love that began with admiration, continued with resonance, and ended in heartbreak. A kind of heartbreak one carries until death. They met at the Actors Studio in New York City. There, James Dean introduced himself to Newman and came on to him in a rather direct way, suggesting that the 2 of them play a love scene in front of the students, saying that they'd set the studio on fire. Well, Paul was shocked. He told Dean, "Hey pal, let's slow down. Where I come from, we like to work up to things." They didn't play a love scene, but Dean had his way with him, and it was 6 a.m. when Paul boarded the Staten Island ferry back to his apartment, where he was living with his wife and son, and it certainly was not the last. Dean told Brackett that he had his way with Paul and taught him to swallow his spit, just like Brackett does. One night, he got him to do it in the doorway of an abandoned building in the meatpacking district. According to Dean, it is all the more exciting when it's done in a dangerous public space. Dean soon explained to Newman that he was a kept boy and took him to the posh apartment he shared with Brackett. During the next 3 weeks, a volcano of lust erupted between the 2. Paul Newman fell head over heels, and Dean was fully in charge of their relationship. Dean made Newman wear a red baseball cap to match his own so that people would see them as a pair. Paul complied willingly. Paul was seen on the West Coast wearing that red cap even after Dean's untimely death. Paul had dominated all his relationships, but that was until he met a certain person that turned the tide. The unbelievable Steve McQueen. They were never meant to get along. Steve was everything Paul wasn't. Rougher, louder, looser. They first met on the set of Somebody Up There Likes Me. McQueen approached Newman and propositioned him after engaging in crude banter, one that could easily be described as insulting. Newman later told his friend Janice Rule that as they ended their conversation, McQueen planted a wet, sloppy kiss on him, with tongue. That was the beginning of a rivalrous relationship that was frequently acrimonious. McQueen was presented with the idea of casting in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, but he turned it down because he wouldn't accept second billing to Newman. The 2 fought like cats and dogs over the positioning of their names on the movie poster for Towering Inferno. McQueen was a brash liar, but even so, Newman found himself strangely attracted to him, and there was obvious sexual tension between the two. But Paul was also having a sexual relationship with Sal Mineo at the time, and Mineo had fallen madly in love with him and wanted to live together as a couple. When Paul rejected that offer, Mineo attempted suicide.
We'll go to that.
Them things get around. Hell, even a dumb fool woman can set up a choker proper.
About this time, also, Newman developed a serious man crush on Robert Wagner, but it did not turn sexual. Then there was Tom Cruise, but it ended with similar results. Once Newman agreed to meet Steve in a cheap hotel in Long Beach, where McQueen said he'd got every woman in Hollywood trying to get him to have his way with her. He said he needed a break, a different kind of action now and then, and Paul. Newman was the kind of change he had in mind. This sort of clandestine activity between the Hollywood rivals went on for years, but it finally came to an end. Years passed. Steve got married, then divorced, then married again. Paul moved on, at least he tried to. They didn't speak for a long time. And then, in 1980, Paul got the call. Steve was dying. Cancer had struck. It came fast and aggressively. Paul went to see him one last time. He found him alone in a hospital room, thinner than he'd ever seen, but still somehow defiant. It was a short romance that Paul really remembered, but the shortest was with Derek. You won't believe how long. Hollywood's shortest relationship. He wasn't like the others. There were no long nights of soul-bearing talks, no letters, no promises, just heat and youth, and two beautiful men who stumbled into each other at exactly the wrong time, or maybe the right one, depending on how you look at it. It was 1953, a rooftop party in Malibu. They spent 3 days together, just 3, a borrowed beach house down the coast. Paul never asked what John wanted. It was obvious enough. He didn't need to. This wasn't a beginning, it was a moment. The men indulged each other for those 3 days. On the last morning, Paul woke up to find John already dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. He didn't say goodbye, just turned, grinned, and said they'd both be someone else by next year. And he was right. John went on to marry one of the most beautiful women in the world, Ursula Andress, then Linda Evans, then Bo Derek. Paul never called him an ex, never called it love, but he kept a Polaroid of those 3 days. The only photo from that weekend, just 2 shirtless men laughing mid-splash in the surf. The sun was so bright, it blurred their faces. He never framed it, never showed it, but he never threw it away. Some stories are meant to be just a page that you keep rereading for the rest of your life, but some contain many pages, like the next one. The Last Love. Paul waited a long time before he said Monty's name out loud, not because he was afraid, but because the pain still hadn't softened. Montgomery Clift was the golden contradiction of his time. Beautiful, brilliant, broken from the very beginning. He didn't just play tortured souls on screen. He was one. When Paul met him in 1956, Clift was already a star, the kind of man who didn't walk into a room, every movement filled with a quiet ache. But it wasn't his beauty that stayed with Paul. It was his sadness. They first connected at a dinner hosted by a mutual friend. Clift was seated alone at the end of a long table, drinking bourbon and humming under his breath. Paul sat beside him, in words. Later that week, Clift called him. No greeting, just one sentence. "You feel like the only safe place in this town." And so began something that wasn't quite a relationship and wasn't just a friendship. It was complicated, tender, fragile, something the world wouldn't have understood, and neither of them could fully define. Monty didn't let people close. He had secrets nested within secrets. He'd seen what Hollywood did to men like him, how it devoured them, rewrote them, erased them. But with Paul, he let a little light in, just enough to feel like love. They would spend entire nights reading poetry, lying on the floor, passing a bottle of gin back and forth like a lifeline. They'd escape to remote cabins, pretending just for a weekend that they were nobodies. But the world was already closing in. The studio found out. Not everything, just enough. They didn't fire him. They didn't confront him. They did something worse. They erased him from the inside. Suddenly, the calls stopped. The roles got smaller. The smiles are more forced. He started drinking more, sleeping less, speaking in riddles. Then came the crash. in May 1956. Monty wrapped his car around a telephone pole, leaving Elizabeth Taylor's house. His face was shattered, his jaw wired shut. His beauty, the currency Hollywood had built him on, was gone. But Paul said it wasn't the accident that broke him. It was the silence that came after. The silence from the people who once called him genius. In 1996, Montgomery Clift was found dead in his apartment. Official cause, heart attack. But Paul never believed that, he said quietly. After his death, Paul found an envelope in a drawer back home. Inside, a photo of the two of them, blurry, off-center, smiling in a sunlit kitchen. On the back, Monty had written, "I was never brave, but with you, I thought about trying." The world remembered him as a movie star, a husband, and a philanthropist. But there was more. There was the boy who kissed James Dean in the rain, the man who held Montgomery Clift through silence, the hands that once shook, lighting a cigarette for Brando. And in the end, there was a voice on a tape recorder finally telling the story no one else dared to tell.
That's bad business. How long do you think I'd stay in operation if every time I pulled a job it cost me money?
Because in old Hollywood, loving another man could destroy your career, could erase your future, could break your soul. But being forgotten for it was the greater tragedy. What do you think about Paul Newman and his numerous gay relationships? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.